Hello, and welcome to my presentation on the Black Lives Matter movement, analyzed through the lens of intercultural persuasion. To begin my presentation, I would like to explain the foundation of this movement and even delve into the roots of the need for this movement in America. According to blacklivesmatter.com, Black Lives Matter was founded in 2013 in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer. Trayvon Martin was an unarmed 17-year-old boy who was shot and killed by neighborhood watchman George Zimmerman, who claimed self-defense. Since Martin's killing in 2013, there have been countless other unarmed black people killed by police or people who claim authority, such as with Zimmerman. The killing that gathered most attention in recent years was that of George Floyd by a policeman in Minneapolis, Minnesota in May of 2020. The killings of innocent black people in America is sadly not a new phenomenon. The idea that white people are superior has been around since the founding of America, and trails of this systemic racism are still paved for the white man today. According to Timothy Borchers in his textbook titled Persuasion in the Media Age, in the United States today, the beliefs, values, and behaviors of European Americans dominate an increasingly diverse population. Protests during the summer of 2020 and for several years prior highlighted not only racist behavior in law enforcement, but also systemic racism throughout society. Borchers goes on to cite sociologist Joe Fegan, who defines systemic racism as a complex array of recurring discriminatory practices that target people of color and the institutionalized inequalities along racial lines that occur in this country. In their own words, the Black Lives Matter movement was founded to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on black communities by the states and vigilantes. The way in which Americans received the Black Lives Matter movement as either right and inspirational or wrong and radical depends solely on the culture and subcultures in which they were raised and the values that they hold. Borchers uses sociologist Robin Williams' definition of values, which he says are criterion or standards of preference that guide our actions, help us develop attitudes toward objects, and are usually the foundation of moral judgments. One's values are usually developed during their upbringing, through their family, and the culture in which they live. Borchers defines culture as the process by which meanings are created in a society of people as well as the products of this process. When referring to the average American's view on black people, it would be fair to assume that many of them are associated with mainstream culture. According to Borchers, mainstream culture refers to the core beliefs, values, and behaviors that have been part of the American dialogue since the beginning, and that have been carried on within a mainstream construction of American culture. This is a very simplified way of explaining why there is still so much violence against blacks in America and puts into perspective just how deep systemic racism runs. Black Lives Matter aims to eradicate white supremacy and put a stop to the cycle of racism that continues to circle our country. Because this issue is not a new one, people needed to come together and cause a bit of a scene in order to really be heard. They needed to create a social movement. Borchers explains that social movements develop when a group of individuals becomes dissatisfied with something in society. The group disassociates from the status quo, rejects the reigning symbols of the dominant culture, and verbalizes its dissatisfaction to others who are persuaded to support the movement. The Black Lives Matter movement began because people are sick of seeing violence against black people, especially at the hands of police. By striking up thousands of Black Lives Matter marches and riots over the past 8 years, members of Black Lives Matter disassociated from the status quo, the main reason for these marches being to verbalize their demands for change and persuade others to support the movement as well. The Black Lives Matter movement uses an assortment of persuasive language and strategies to appeal to their audience, starting with the name of their movement. This is not only the name of their organization, but also their slogan. Borchers defines a slogan as terms, phrases, or expressions that suggest a course of action to individuals. Slogans are powerful because they can crystallize in a few words the ideas or themes associated with an issue, cause, or event. Slogans also have an emotional component that elicits reactions from audience members. Black Lives Matter utilizes this persuasive language along with the persuasive strategy of marches. Borchers explains that the march is a strategy used by social movements to gain attention that combines visual images and language strategies. Black Lives Matter marches include many people holding signage with additional phrases and slogans associated with the movement. They also chant and behave as a group in a way that persuades others to listen to their pleas and perhaps even join them in their efforts. One way in which the Black Lives Matter movement gathered momentum was through social media. According to an article titled "The Social Media Response to Black Lives Matter: How Twitter Users Interact with Black Lives Matter Through Hashtag Use," from the journal Ethnic and Racial Studies, during the first year after the movement's conception, Black Lives Matter was mentioned over 660,000 times on Twitter during their 11-month search period, and the Black Lives Matter hashtag was used over 65,000 times. Other hashtags related to the movement were also used, as in hashtag justice for a black victim of police brutality, hashtag we can't breathe, or hashtag say their names. Utilizing this hashtag allowed the message of the movement to spread worldwide and unite followers. Borchers states that movements have used social media in three primary ways: to mobilize protests, to sustain collective identities, and to disseminate sympathetic frames for movement messages as a counterbalance to mainstream narratives. Social media efforts are one way in which audiences were persuaded to think and learn about the movement. The ways in which Black Lives Matter protests were talked about on news shows depended on the source. According to Borchers, no single news source is trusted by a majority of U.S. adults. Though Republicans trust Fox News far more than any other news outlet, and Democrats trust CNN about as much as Republicans trust Fox News. Different news outlets depict the protests differently depending on the audience for the media source. In many cases of right-wing media, protests were portrayed as conflict between police and protesters without focusing on the movement's actual intent, being a response to racial injustice. These twists in one singular narrative caused different groups to view the Black Lives Matter movement in drastically different ways. The previously mentioned journal from Ethnic and Racial Studies stated that as Black Lives Matter increased its volume on social media, counter-movement hashtags also appeared. After Black Lives Matter had gathered a bit of momentum, counter-movements such as All Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter emerged. Borchers states that counter-movements develop in response to calls for social change made by a social movement. Social movements and counter-movements attempt to influence public policy but in oppositional directions. Counter-movements emerge when the social movement they oppose gains strength and becomes popular. While social movements attempt to persuade external audiences to support their cause, counter-movements strive to create internal solidarity. He continues that, as a result, counter-movements see external communication as threatening, portray their viewpoint as the only rational one in the conversation, and protect their right to express their feelings publicly while blocking the social movement's right to do so. All Lives Matter is a counter-movement that claims the Black Lives Matter movement excludes all other races and that all lives matter. According to a recent publication from the British Journal of Social Psychology, supporters of All Lives Matter claim that their colorblind position is more inclusive, seemingly interpreting Black Lives Matter as only Black Lives Matter. This position was further propagated as high-ranked Republican representatives described Black Lives Matter as racist and divisive and expressed a clear preference for terms like All Lives Matter. Blue Lives Matter, or Back the Blue, is another example of a counter-movement to Black Lives Matter that advocates for police rights and calls for those who kill law enforcement to be sentenced under a hate crime status. Though these counter-movements have their own agendas, they were only founded in response to Black Lives Matter, and whether those involved agree to this or not, these counter-movements foster the us versus them mentality. To summarize all of this information, the Black Lives Matter movement is one that expanded rapidly and influenced many people around the world. To understand how exactly they were influenced, it is important to keep in mind their previously held culture and values. According to the British Journal of Social Psychology, a pre-registered cross-sectional study found that anti-Black racism predicts white participants' support for All Lives Matter, even when controlling for political affiliations. The results support the suggestion that preference for All Lives Matter over Black Lives Matter is indicative of both implicit racism and ideological stances that minimize or discourage the recognition of contemporary forms of racial discrimination. They found that consuming conservative media was associated with more negativity towards Black Lives Matter, though liberal media was not necessarily associated with positivity towards Black Lives Matter. It was found that higher levels of social dominance orientation, a preference for social hierarchies rather than equality, predicted more support for All Lives Matter. Because of their predispositions and previously held beliefs, some people were persuaded to go against Black Lives Matter and advocate for these counter-movements, though none of them would have begun if it wasn't for Black Lives Matter. The Black Lives Matter movement is still an ongoing one, but after the height of their protests and calls for action, they achieved quite a bit of change. According to an article by American Civil Liberties Union, organizers have effected significant change locally and nationally, including the ousting of high-profile corrupt prosecutors. Black Lives Matter compelled Democrats to restructure their national platform to include issues such as criminal justice reform. The Black Lives Matter movement's unrelenting work on the issue of police corruption helped incite the release of 4 unprecedented U.S. Department of Justice reports that confirmed the widespread presence of police corruption in Baltimore, Chicago, Ferguson, and Cleveland. By using the tools of social media, Black Lives Matter was the first U.S. social movement in history to successfully use the internet as a mass mobilization device. Black Lives Matter is stronger, larger, and more global now than ever before, and the success of their movement is evidence of their ability to persuade their audiences to stand up and fight for what they believe in and for what is right.